Hello, darling.
Aloha, filmmakers and fellow storytellers. I'm Matthew Salanoa, director of 007 I Only Need One, and filmmaker for over 17 years. I'm here to talk to you about action movies, storytelling through action. I grew up learning about movies. When I went to college, there was a lot of misconceptions about what action movies have to offer in terms of storytelling. And so now I've been seasoned, I've been doing a lot of different things across the years, and I wanted to bring to you, the young storyteller who maybe doesn't know what to think about movies or storytelling, or if you're a filmmaker who doesn't believe action movies have anything to do with storytelling, I'm here to tell you otherwise. So today is my orientation, my first episode, and I'd like to use this episode's theme to be about how does action define character? And first off, what is storytelling? Storytelling through action, what does that mean? Isn't action just for fun, dazzling effects to keep me happy in between all the romantic parts of a movie? No, action is absolutely a part of the storytelling. But in order to understand that, we have to walk back one more. What is a story? Well, when I was in college, one of my screenwriting teachers, really brilliant guy, James D'Alessandro, gave my class a little lesson on that very thing. And his definition was, story is character, character is conflict, conflict is character, character is story. And what that really means is conflict, which doesn't necessarily have to mean two people are actually fighting, but it just has to mean a disagreement. It has to mean a collision of two opposing ideals, two opposing concepts, two characters after the same thing, or even one character conflicted about what he wants. So if that's storytelling, if that's what a movie is, if a movie is watching a character battle against or for the things that they want, then that's our fundamental understanding of what a story is. So when it comes to action movies, how does action tell a story? And to do this, because in general with this podcast, I'll probably talk about one movie or another, but just to get you guys into what I'm talking about, I want to bring up a few different movies that have different levels of how action tells the story. And stories come from a lot of different places. Sometimes they're personal, sometimes they're more message-based, like a cautionary tale. And one of those stories that I'm going to talk about right now, Romeo and Juliet. Specifically, William Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, directed by Baz Luhrmann. So this movie starts off with a bunch of characters, a bunch of goofy hooligans who are from the Montague family, and they're all young men in their 20s, partying, wilding, driving around, being nuts, and they cross paths at the gas station with the Capulets, a slightly better dressed, more esteemed bunch of 20-something-year-olds, and these two young groups of men immediately get into a conflict of respect, who is more respectful, who is disrespecting who, and it explodes into an action scene, an epic action scene featuring John Leguizamo. This is one of my hero moments. This is where John Leguizamo became a hero to me as a young man, where I was like, whoa. I mean, granted, it's cheesy, it's over the top, but he has such a fire, and he just really believes in himself in the moment as the Prince of Cats, the suavest, best swordsman there is. That's his character. And you see the way he behaves in the action scene. He shoots, he's a bit wild, he's still not hitting people, but he clearly has better aim than some of the Montague boys who are shooting wildly and not hitting anything anywhere close to anybody. So as these two factions of young men engage and start fighting each other, you see on the Montague side, the character played by Jamie Kennedy and his gang of people, they're shooting wildly. They're not hitting anything at all. When you see the Capulet side and you see Tybalt, played by John Leguizamo, Once the action starts popping, while everyone else is getting a little bit more frantic, John Leguizamo is cool as a cucumber. It's over the top, it's cheesy, his poses are very dramatic, but you see that across the action scene while everyone else freaks out. John Leguizamo is cool. He thinks of himself as cool. He's literally smoking a cigarette during the entire action scene. And you see he's the only one who actually gets a shot at one of the Montague boys. Now, luckily, that guy doesn't die. This explodes into an even bigger action sequence that mostly happens off camera, but you see that the carnage caused by this battle is stirring up the whole town. People are running, there's traffic jams, people are scared on the streets, and we have the prince, or the sheriff, the chief prince, I think he's called in the movie, played by an excellent actor, who's also a really great director. The prince arrives, and at the moment of truth, when Tybalt and his Montague opposite, Benvolio, both have guns drawn at each other, you know that this might just be the last moment of both of their lives. Just at that moment is when the prince shows up to break up the action. And so while we get this huge action sequence that, you know, on the surface, it's kind of over the top, it's kind of goofy, but what exactly is it that defines the character during this action scene? Well, I already said it for Tybalt. Tybalt, once things exploded, was cool as a cucumber. He's the only one who got a shot on one of the Montague boys. But Benvolio, before the fight happened, he was actually trying to stop it from happening. So in many ways, you can see literally Benvolio in the name itself sounds like benevolent flipped. So Benvolio tries to stop the fight from happening. And so when Benvolio fights, it is defensively. It is to defend his own life. And that's the only reason. But when Tybalt fights, it is to prove that he is the master of other men and that he's superior to other men. This is his character and his attitude, which is why he's so dramatic and so in charge of himself in the moment, and why he literally in his own lines says he loves to fight and he loves to kill Montagues. So this is where our characters are established, but also this action scene, while it not only establishes two of our core characters for the story of Romeo and Juliet, it establishes the entire world that we're living in for the rest of this story, where it's these two families who have a grudge that goes back generations, and the grudge has lasted so long that the children of these families continue to war out with each other at the expense of the city that they live in. And so that's how not only did we define characters who Tybalt would later become really the villain of the story, who he won't let go of his pride and he won't let go of his prejudice against this Montague family, that when Romeo meets Juliet and, you know, that party sequence happens, his offense just for this Montague arriving at his family's party runs so deep that he will charge into the Montague boys' recreational area and he'll challenge Romeo to a battle because it means that much to him to still be the superior person on the block, even though it ends up tragically and he does not actually end up killing Romeo. But when he kills Mercutio, Romeo's best friend, another amazing dramatic sequence in this movie, that is what makes Romeo go after Tybalt. But again, this very same fight scene, how does it define the character? Before this fight, Romeo met Juliet, fell in love, and married her. And so when Tybalt came to challenge Romeo, Romeo allowed Tybalt to smack him and hurt him, saying that he would prefer to love Tybalt than ever lay a hand on him. But he's just not saying why. And Tybalt just keeps pushing him to pick up his weapon and fight him. And it's not until Tybalt goes too far that Mercutio intercedes, and really the fight becomes between them. That both Mercutio and Romeo fight for love, and Romeo, out of love, does not want to fight. So his character is defined in the sequence. So every single action scene is part of the storytelling of this play and perfectly executed in the movie. So let's move on. That's one, I think, very good example of how action defines character, but at the same time tells the larger part of the story, because the entire story is what matters. Action movies that have action scenes that don't tell the story, that's where you tend to get bored, because as much as the choreography might be good, the explosions might be fun, if you're not feeling the emotion of the character, and if what happens in the action scene does not affect the character throughout the rest of the movie, then the action scene does not actually matter. Just like any other scene in the movie, if you get scenes that don't move the character forward or don't challenge the character in some kind of way, then that's where audiences get bored and don't care about the action anymore. So let's move on to another example. One of my favorite films of all time, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Now here I can talk a little bit about music and how it plays into action as well. I'm just going to talk about the opening scenes, the character introductions for the titular Good, Bad, and Ugly. So those of you who haven't seen this movie, I'm not going to spoil the whole movie for you, but I will spoil the opening 15 minutes just because I think it's a great example for defining character in a quick way, where the action scene it's not a long action scene. Romeo and Juliet has long extended action sequences that are all about characters trying to either dominate each other or defend themselves from trouble. But when we get into The Good, the Bad, the Ugly, we're in the Wild West. It's bounty hunters versus criminals, and it's a very cold world where life doesn't seem to matter as much to the people who are alive. So when we get to the start of this movie, it's one of the most famous quoted film sequences of all time, where we start on a few different cowboys entering what seems to be an empty town. And you think it's two men who are about to shoot each other. And then a third man appears, and you think, are they all going to shoot each other? And all of a sudden, they walk up to the door of a saloon, they draw guns, and then they burst into the saloon, and then we do not see what happens. All of a sudden, there's an explosion of gunfire, and bursting out of the window of the saloon is the Ugly, played by Eli Wallach. And he bursts out of the window, literally a chicken leg or a turkey leg in his mouth, guns drawn, and he looks around like a wild little rat. And then he runs off. And then after he runs off, one of the cowboys we saw from the beginning stumbles out. He stumbles out of the door, and he tries to raise his gun, but you see he's been shot in the shoulder, and when he fires, the gunshot knocks him backward. And obviously he misses, and the Ugly gets away. So I'll explain what this means in a minute. When we get to the next character, the Bad, we're introduced to Lee Van Cleef, who is riding a horse to this little, seems like a little homestead, a little farm-like area where a donkey's pushing a wheel for some reason. I don't know what it's for. He arrives at this little homestead, and we have in complete silence. He stops at a door, and when we get a shot that's known as a frame within a frame within a frame, where we see multiple doorways, and at the end of that doorway is the Bad, Lee Van Cleef, who stares at someone inside. And then he enters, and we see this cozy little home, this cozy little kitchen dining area, where an old man is eating his breakfast with his son. And he has lots of bread, and he has soup, and they don't seem wealthy, but they do seem comfortable. Lee Van Cleef's character does not say much, but he makes it clear that he's looking for someone. And the old man, who's so scared, who's so intimidated by this person who's just arrived dressed in black, and he's clearly here to do some kind of destructive behavior. And he just starts spouting out all these different things until finally he says something that actually is interesting to Lee Van Cleef. And he says, "I don't know anything about the cash box." And he's like, "Really? A cash box, huh? Tell me about the cash box." Lee Van Cleef was here to get a name, but he did not expect to get information about a whole bunch of money. So essentially, the old man assumes Lee Van Cleef has come to shoot him down. And he offers him a bunch of money, and then suddenly draws his gun and tries to shoot Lee Van Cleef, but Lee Van Cleef's faster and shoots first. And then the old man's son comes down the stairs with a shotgun and points it at him. And again, Lee Van Cleef draws, shoots the son dies. So when Lee Van Cleef goes to his boss, who's hired him to go talk to this man, he tells him that he found the name and he found out about the cash box. So he realizes, even though it's not stated directly, he realizes he has been hired to find a name unknowingly, because he's actually been hired to help find some extra cash. And he explains that the old man that he killed gave him money, and he assumes it was because the old man wanted him to kill his boss. And the boss screams, "No, no!" And then Lee Van Cleef shoots him and smiles, because now he's going to go look for that name and look for that money. And right up front, one thing I want to explain, something that was explained to me, because the person who got me to watch this was actually my uncle, who explained this opening scene and said, "Oh, in the Old West, there was still the rules that you don't shoot first. You shoot the person who's trying to get you." So you notice in the scene, the hero never shoots first. Someone points at him and then he shoots back defensively. And that's one thing to sort of know. But just up front, with the opening of the ugly and the bad, both of them shot defensively, except in the case of the bad, when he killed the old man was begging for his life. And he only killed him because he was on his own mission to take over the mission that the old man was clearly up to. So next we get reintroduced to the ugly, and he's being strung up by his neck in front of a court of people, and he's about to be hung, and they're reading out all of his list of crimes. And then we see the bad arrive, and he's talking to someone trying to get information on that name. Some woman is watching the ugly, Eli Wallach, and listening to all the crimes he's committed, and says, "Good God, how a man could do so many terrible things." And Lee Van Cleef looks and says, "Well, not every man hangs for his crimes. Sometimes an angel looks out for them." And then he notices someone in a barn above with a rifle pointed into the court, and says, "A golden-haired angel watches this one." And what he's referring to is Clint Eastwood is in the barn watching the whole scene with his rifle trained on Eli Wallach. But he's not going to shoot Eli Wallach. He's going to shoot the rope. And that's what Lee Van Cleef is noticing this whole time. And what we don't know, if you watch this movie first, which I did, you don't know that Lee Van Cleef has a history with Clint Eastwood, where they teamed up in the previous movie. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly is the third part, and there's 2 movies prior. But the second movie is where they met and they teamed up to take down some other criminals. So here in this moment, we see just as they're about to slap the horse, because Eli Wallach is sitting on a horse with the rope around his neck. All they're going to do is slap the horse to make the horse run away once they've declared all of his crimes. But as soon as they are about to slap the horse, that's when Clint Eastwood fires his gun, the rope snaps, and the horse runs away, but with Eli Wallach on his back, getting to safety. And then Clint Eastwood shoots the hats off of 3 different men. So when Clint Eastwood runs away, he meets up with Eli Wallach and they count their money, because Clint Eastwood collected money. He was the bounty hunter who found Eli Wallach, which led to this whole sequence. But when they're counting their money, because this was all a gag, their whole con is going to various counties. Clint Eastwood turns in Eli Wallach for all of his crimes and collects the bounty. And then just before getting hung, Clint Eastwood springs him free and they split the money. But this time around, it's clear that they've done this a number of times. And Clint Eastwood says, you know what? I don't think we're ever going to make any more money than this doing this con. And he chooses to keep the money. And with Eli Wallach still tied to his hands with a rope around his neck, although he's on his feet now, that's when Clint Eastwood decides to pocket the money and just ride away. And he gets a far enough away distance that Eli Wallach is screaming at him, he's cursing him, and Clint Eastwood has one really good line: "Such ingratitude for all the times I've saved your life." And that's the introduction of the good. He's the good one. Now I want to introduce a point here. If you notice, in each of these character introductions, our heroes shoot 3 men. Eli Wallach kills 2, and the other survives by the hair of his chinny chin chin. Lee Van Cleef kills 3 men, an old man, his son, and the person who hired him to go get those guys. But Clint Eastwood is the only one who doesn't kill anybody. Now, this is not entirely true. When we're first introduced to Clint Eastwood, he does kill a couple bounty hunters who were trying to collect Eli Wallach, but they all drew guns at him first. So we realize that for the ugly and for the good, they both kill pretty much defensively. But when it comes to Lee Van Cleef, he kills sadistically, methodically. There's a reason he does it. And even though none of these characters are technically good people, Lee Van Cleef, without question, is immoral. The ugly is amoral. The good is amoral. Lee Van Cleef is immoral. Because we later see in the movie Lee Van Cleef beats a woman for information. He tortures the ugly for information. And he only spares Clint Eastwood's character due to their history and due to the fact that he realizes torturing Clint Eastwood won't yield him any good results for getting information. So across this movie, we consistently see how the ugly, he only looks out for the good when it's in his best interest. Because he does come back for revenge against Clint Eastwood. But situations happen where he does have to look out for Clint Eastwood because they both end up having mutual interests down the road. But when it comes to Lee Van Cleef, he's always consistently abusive, abuses his power, kills without compassion. And when it comes to Clint Eastwood, we consistently see him choose compassionate choices for people who he sees are suffering. So, in this way, our characters are defined by their actions, and while it's a Western and the action is mostly a lot of quick gunshots, it's still enough to tell you where these characters lie in terms of their moral character. Where Clint Eastwood won't kill anyone who he doesn't have to if he's not hunting for them, or if it's not out of self-defense, he's not going to kill anybody. Lee Van Cleef will gladly kill people who are defenseless and weaker than him because it pleases him. And when we come to Eli Wallach, he kills if it's fun or if it benefits him, but he's nowhere near the sadist that the bad is. So while all of them are bad people, Lee Van Cleef plays the worst of them. So this whole story will come to a head with these three men facing off against each other in what is one of the most famous sequences in film history. But the whole movie, you're going to wonder who's going to get who and why, because their allegiances change, their mission never changes. They all want to make money. But you see that as the story goes on, it's a story of the odd couple of the good and the ugly having to team up to survive against the bad, and the bad having all these resources to be worse than anyone needs to be to other human beings. But their character is defined by how they kill people and why they kill people. And it's murky waters because nobody's actually a good character. So that's another way that action tells the story. And because you can tell their character just by watching the performances, because you can tell their character across the movie that the way they fight has everything to do with who they are as people. Who they hurt or kill has everything to do about who they are as people. When you see Clint Eastwood across all of the movies, he never kills anyone he doesn't have to, and he always tries to kill people who are other bad people, who kill mercilessly, who kill for criminal reasons. So while he's no angel himself, he is the angel of death for the wicked. Last but not least, I'm just going to talk about one action scene. Now, I've talked about how action defines character in the case of the story, or how action defines character across a story. But the next level of storytelling is, does it have meaning? Does it have meaning? Which by that, what I'm trying to say is there a meaning behind the story? Does the meaning come before the story? Does the story actually explain a message or a concept that a storyteller or director is trying to accomplish? Now, I can't take credit for this example because actually this was my first lesson in how action tells a story. But I've chosen it as the third example because I believe it's actually the most advanced. Ang Lee directed the Academy Award-winning picture Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon takes place in medieval-ish China. Chow Yun-fat and Michelle Yeoh play the protectors of the Sword of Destiny. And it's an ancient tradition that every generation, a protector from a young age until they die, must defend the sword and only ever use the sword in defense of the empire. The sword represents the opulence and the history of this long-standing hierarchy, of this long-standing tradition. Zhang Ziyi appears as a thief who steals the sword in the middle of the night. And Michelle Yeoh engages in a whole fight with her to stop her from stealing the sword. And there's a particular section of the fight, which is really the majority of their fight. Zhang Ziyi is trying to escape with the sword. Michelle Yeoh keeps grabbing her and pulling her down. Literally, Zhang Ji leaps, and because it's a martial arts movie, and in this particular case, the type of martial arts movie where physics doesn't matter. So Zhang Ji literally trying to fly like an anime character away from this area, and Michelle Yeoh keeps leaping up, grabbing her, and pulling her down. So this behavior, not only is it defining our characters and their specific missions. One wants to steal it, we can assume for money or for some purpose. The other wants to keep it for tradition, right? That is the exact notion of what this fight is about. It is about the young generation trying to break out of tradition and the older generation trying to hold them down and keep them in their traditional roles. So this is a symbolic fight. It's a fight that has meaning behind it. And I would not say the filmmaking necessarily tells you whether one is right or the other is right. But what I'll say is this movie, while it has lots of amazing martial arts sequences, it's really about the characters themselves. And more importantly, it's about the parallels of two love stories. You see, stories are about characters and their conflict, right? This is what this whole talk is about. When we started off with Romeo and Juliet, it is the warring of two families that makes it impossible for love to be allowed between two of the members of the families. Hence, they have to hide their relationship because of what is established in the beginning, all the drama of the two families warring all the time. When it comes to the good, the bad, and the ugly, all of these characters are bad people, but we have the joining of the good and the ugly to try to survive the rampage of violence that comes from the bad. And in their survival, they find a form of brotherhood across the movie. So even though they both hate each other, even though Eli Wallach wants to kill Clint Eastwood for leaving him in the desert with a noose around his neck and his hands tied and stealing the money, because all he asked for was his half of the cash. Forget the rest. Just give him his half of the cash, and Clint Eastwood just leaves him. So, but even though they have that, because the bad is after them, and they both have some information that he wants, it forces them to keep each other alive. And across the movie, Clint Eastwood gets to know about Eli Wallach's character, that he has a brother who has kind of disowned him. And in this weird, messed up adventure, in a sad and unusual kind of way, Clint Eastwood becomes his brother because they keep having to look out for each other, even though it's only for selfish goals. But here, when we come to, now we have the love of two lovers, and then we have the love of brothers happening for different reasons under different contexts, but the action defines that conflict. So the action is not absent from telling the story. It's in fact a crucial part in telling that story. The fact that the good and the ugly do not have shootouts with each other only because they need to or have to, or feel that if they were to kill each other, it would give the advantage to the bad. So we have different contexts, but either way, the conflict always leads to these characters butting heads, finding some kind of common ground, but also still having conflict across that story until we reach the story's end, when all the final confrontations occur. In the case of Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon, we have the parallel love stories. And I think it's not a mistake that Zhang Ji and Michelle Yeoh are the ones who are fighting over the sword. They are both the female counterpart of their own love story. When we see Zhang Ji's love story, she was a woman who was kidnapped by a criminal who was going to hold her for ransom, but they end up falling in love, and she joins him in the crimes. And in the case of Michelle Yeoh, she is a fellow warrior designated to protect the sword with Chow Yun-fat, And tradition says that these two, because they're warriors, should never find love, never make a family, because their life must be committed to protecting the sword, or aka protecting tradition. So their love remains unspoken, even though it's very clear from just glances, from the way they talk to each other, that there's something emotional underneath the surface. But their love, they refuse to express for each other. On the side of the criminals, they fully express their love. So you see, even though our heroes are technically the good guys, a tradition is holding them both back from having happiness. And so, is that really good? And even though our bad guys are bad guys, by breaking tradition, they're allowed to have the love that they want and live the life that they want. So, when we have these two love stories competing with each other, the way the movie ends, I won't spoil for you if you haven't seen it, but all these relationships come to a head. So this fight is, and it's a fight between the two female entities, right? The female counterparts. It's a mother versus a daughter. Symbolically, it's a mom trying to get her daughter to stay with tradition, even though they're not related. That's the essence of their conflict. The wise one holding back the young, rambunctious one. And is, in the question of the movie, is it right to break tradition for happiness? Even if that breaking tradition would be considered bad by society's terms. And it's up to you, the viewer, to decide that by the end of the movie. But you see that what the characters go through represents all of the baggage of that conflict and all of the baggage of what the conflict represents. So I just wanted to talk about these examples because when I look at movies, I'll be honest with you, when I was in my younger days, even after college, I didn't pay attention to movies. I thought I knew everything about movies. And actually the movie that I was wrong about was The Dark Knight Rises. I was very against that movie when it first came out, and yet it was the wonderful Danica, comic book girl 19, who explained all of the themes and meanings behind that film, that after that I fully understood what I was missing out on. And every time I watch that movie, I realize how great it is. Not perfect, but great. So one of those things that's important to understand is that action movies are good movies. Not all of them. But not every drama is a great movie either. It's important to understand if you want to be a storyteller or if you are a storyteller and you hold this belief in your head that an action movie is not a movie with a story, then you are not appreciating or understanding what the genre is. Let's not forget that film all began silently. Movies used to have no words at all, perhaps words on the screen, perhaps dialogue that would be shown on the screen with text. But in general, the movies had to communicate as much as possible, purely visually, because that's what the medium is. And truth be told, think about yourself. Think about when you were a kid and you absorbed everything visually. You couldn't talk yet, but as you did things, if you spat your food out and your mom got angry at you, you realized, oh, I shouldn't spit my food out, or at least I shouldn't spit it all over the table. Just keep it on my own plate, right? We learn visually. We learn through expressions. Learning visually is one of our basic components of, at the very least, sighted people. But even to that end, consider that there are audiobooks. Consider that there's audio descriptive movies for people who are blind, right? Even the description must be visual, because visuals are not just having to do with your sight. It's in here, it's in your mind. That is why in most of my podcasts, I don't cut away to clips, because if you're a storyteller and you're watching my show, the most powerful tool you have is your mind, and creating the scene in your head first as a picture, because a picture is worth 1,000 words. Charlie Chaplin's films were entirely visual, where Charlie Chaplin, the famous actor-director, his character, the tramp, would always get into all these hijinks and always get into all these different problems. But he would often find love or find a friend or befriend someone who needed him. And across the story, you see his struggle to keep people he cares about safe and well. But it's all defined by his action. It's all defined by his character. And literally, if we're talking about action, even the word itself does not mean violence. It just means movement. That every movement is a part of telling the story, which is why I say action is dialogue without words. It's so important, if you're a storyteller, to master the notions of whatever genre you're interested in. I am a fan of the action genre, of science fiction, of fantasy, and primarily superheroes. And superheroes are a merging of genres, but they are essentially action movies. So action movies, storytelling through action. What does that actually mean? Well, let's talk about basic fundamentals. The simplest form of this example can be superheroes, or in the case I'm going to use, Super Sentai, Power Rangers. How does action define character? How does it define the story? Monster from the bad guy shows up and starts destroying the city, hurting people carelessly, recklessly. It does not care about people. It's just trying to cause destruction. The heroes arrive and only fight the monster. They don't fight any humans. They don't fight anybody. They only use and they don't try to start a fight with the monster. The monster has already created the destruction. So the Power Rangers or the Super Sentai only fight to defend their city, their fellow people. Super simple, right? That's good versus evil. One side kills and destroys for conquering purposes, and the other fights only to defend other people. That's the simplest way I can define a character, a villain and a hero, right? But as you get into other storytelling, the waters get a little more murky. Okay. So, and if you have the chance, so that's what I have to say about Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon. If you have the chance to watch that movie, go check it out. Like I said, I can't really take credit for this lesson because this one was the first lesson I ever learned about action when I first learned about screenwriting and about filmmaking. I think it was in a textbook or a news article, but it was a wonderful explanation that I feel really elevates the material when you know it. When you're watching the movie, you'll be entertained. But I think all the better to watch the movie and actually have knowledge of why. Why did the director choose to have Zhang Ji fly in the air and have Michelle Yeoh pull her down? As a visual, it seems redundant, but it's not. It is literally the story of the characters defined through their action. And so I hope that you see across all of these different stories and movies that I've brought up that action is a critical part of telling the story. That actually, if you really think about it, you screenwriters and directors, if you really think about it, with all the dialogue people have with each other, where's the most tension? The most tension is between the lines. When the doctor comes out to tell the family, I'm so sorry, your child didn't make it. Or when two people meet at a cafe and they're both so elated with each other, but they're scared to say the words, I like you, I love you. They're scared to say it. These things are conflict. When a character is by themselves and can't decide whether to go left or right on a road, that's inner conflict. So character is conflict. Conflict is character. The wonderful words from James D'Alessandro. And a story is made out of the character's conflict. So I just wanted to make this show because I really feel that many storytellers don't get the point of action. And the reason why people are fans of action is not what they think it is. Of course, the action should be spectacular. It should be visually pleasing, whether it's cheesy and stylized, or whether it's quick and emotional, or whether it's dramatically visual. The most important thing is that if you're a true storyteller, the action is still a part of the emotional journey. And if you notice in all of these movies, there's always dramatic close-ups on whoever the actor is who's involved with the conflict or the drama. Even if that drama is as simple as a shootout, as a three-way standoff. All of that emotion and conflict is in that close-up as people decide, who am I going to shoot? When am I going to shoot? Do I have to shoot two different people at the same time with one gun? How would that even work? What am I going to do? Or if the conflict is someone trying to escape another person because they don't want to live the way they live. But that conflict comes out of the face, even through the mask, it's through those eyes. And again, to speak to, people saying, but what about blind people? Well, wouldn't you still tell the story the same way if you had a friend who was blind? You would still tell the story the same way. You say, well, all of a sudden these three guys went into this giant field with a giant circle and stood in three different edges of that circle, and we didn't know who was going to shoot who, and it just kept going. The camera just kept going to each of their faces. You see they're all confused and scared, and they keep looking at each other, and they don't know who's going to do what. You know what I mean? You would still tell it that same way, because storytelling is also auditory. And we must remember it all goes back to the caves. It all goes back to telling a story over the campfire. That's where it all begins. So, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you learned something, or at least got an interesting insight into movies. This is what my podcast is going to be. Most of the time, I'll be focusing on a single movie and spoiling the hell out of it. So this is a special spoiler-free, or mostly spoiler-free, orientation episode into what action movies, storytelling through action, is about. Thank you for watching, and I hope I see you next time. Mahalo and aloha.